Thank you very much. So, the hypothesis, the idea I want to explore, as stated in the title, this is just the idea that passion has an aesthetic dimension, and I should begin by saying what I mean by this. So, the thought is that passion is capable of affording a kind of satisfaction or answering to a kind of interest, which merits being described as aesthetic, as distinct from the cognitive and ethical interests, which are, of course, also in play in our awareness of our emotional states. The claim is not that every instance of passion is aesthetically rewarding, which is certainly, unfortunately, not the case, but that passion, by virtue of its nature, carries with it an aesthetic potential. And this is something different from saying that passion provides the materials for art or other aesthetic constructions, as many theories of art tell us. Again, it's distinct from the claim that people in states of passion can be viewed aesthetically or made the topic of aesthetically interesting representations. And again, it goes beyond the commonplace that passions are capable of giving worldly objects, the things they're directed at, a kind of emotional coloring which makes them aesthetically valuable. So the idea, to repeat, is that passion has a reflexive aesthetic potential on the inside, that is, for the one who undergoes it. And this arises from its constitution, not from the external imposition of anything on it, though, of course, special conditions are required for the potential to be realized. And the first thing I should say is that this is not my idea. So the idea is taken from a book by Charles Altieri, distinguished critic of literary and pictorial modernism, books called The Particulars of Rapture, and the subtitle, Aesthetics of the Affects, makes plain the dead. Altieri wants to argue in this book first that reflection on the literary and visual arts shows the narrowness of philosophical discussion of emotion, and then wants to show how we might try and correct for it. The reason for philosophy's limitation of scope, he suggests, is that the relatively stable and enduring affective objects that philosophy fixes on are only the most obvious, easily pinned downable items, the equivalent of epistemology's medium-sized dry goods. And to concentrate on these, he suggests, is like trying to map the geography of a country by attending only to its mountains. The narrowness of this focus has two main causes. In the case of early modern discussion of the topic, it results from the dominance of moral and therapeutic concerns. In contemporary work, it arises from the way that analysis of emotion takes the ascriptions of common sense psychology, so proud of, glad that, envious of, and so on, as its starting point. Altieri's thought is that art, on account of its autonomy or relative autonomy, its independence from the explanatory and normative concerns that constrain common sense or folk psychology, is able to give us access to the real complexity of affective phenomena, which philosophy, without this assistance, fails to grasp. And his further motive has to do with critical practice. I think his instincts are clearly with old-style romantic criticism, and this puts him at odds with prevailing tendencies in literary and art theory. Well, I'm going to cite one of Altieri's examples in order to try and float the main idea and hopefully show something of its appeal, but I'm not going to go into the detail of the book, although there is a great deal of interest in his attempt to furnish philosophy with, as he puts it, a new vocabulary and grammar for talking about the affects. So my aim is instead to approach Altieri's idea from a rather more a priori angle and to show that it has some precedent in the history of philosophy. The other thing I should say in advance is that the talk is something of a patchwork, and it circles around the idea that I've just described without really pinning it down. So I'm keenly aware that this attempt to bring various things under a single heading may in the end not add up to a convincing whole. At least, I hope at least that the parts are interesting. So the structure of the talk is as follows, beginning then with an example taken from Altieri. I'll then suggest that a version of the idea is present in Nietzsche, and it forms part of his reply to Schopenhauer, and can spend some time on that because this brings out, I think, or it's one way of bringing out the importance of the idea that passion has an aesthetic dimension. Now, the fact that Nietzsche attaches importance to the passions does not, of course, mean that he has a theory of it as such, or even provides the materials needed to answer the pure conceptual question of what makes an aesthetic dimension possible in the passions. So in the second half of the talk, I'm going to begin by first spelling out the fairly obvious puzzle surrounding the idea that passion can be aesthetic, and then in response, I will sketch something like a general model of emotion, which, whether or not it stands up to scrutiny considered in more general, broader terms, at least so I will claim, supports, coheres with the main idea of the paper. So Altieri's large-scale thesis is that affects themselves are capable of exhibiting aesthetic qualities. And this is, again, not merely to say that affects are capable of arousing further second-order feelings, as when, for example, I take pleasure in the fact that I feel compassion because it shows that I have virtue. Altieri's claim is that states of passion can exhibit an aesthetic dimension in something like the way that the configuration of elements in a painting or a text can be aesthetically significant. And here is how he goes through, illustrates the point in connection with central scenes in Othello, where we are, in his words, presented with a situation where the aesthetic values involved clearly contrast with any instrumental analysis of the situation. So he writes, suppose that someone were to take an aesthetic attitude towards his or her own jealousy, not simply as an observer of what being jealous involves, as a psychologist might, but as an artist whose medium is one's own psyche. Most interpreters would find such reveling in jealousy at best a misjudgment, at worst lunacy. Altieri then goes on to observe that critical commentary on Othello tends to adopt what he thinks of as a cognitivist, a therapeutic approach to the emotions. So critics, in addition to, of course, pondering the great mystery of Iago, they puzzle over how is it that Othello can come to believe what he does about Desdemona. They ask what hidden motives and susceptibilities might move him to do so, and so on. Well, all of those are cogent questions, but Altieri proposes instead, or rather as well, suppose that, rather than judging how Othello goes wrong, we ask what might be of value in the experience he has by virtue of his going wrong. What modes of intensity, what kinds of involvement with others become possible? Rather than stress the sense of pathos from the outside, an aesthetic attitude will ask how we can flesh out what it must have meant to him to put the case performatively, the pity of it, Iago, the pity of it. For it seems that his awareness of the tragedy he is enacting gives him access to ecstatic states completely lost in a moral or strictly action-oriented account of his situation. So what Altieri goes on to say, what he thinks comes into view for Othello in his jealousy is the full span of his love and need for Desdemona. He sees its exalted quality, its erotic, bestial roots, his own powerlessness in face of its incomprehensibility, the way that it defies ethical and cognitive regulation, and so on. And this configuration is presented to Othello not as a set of psychological or ethical truths into which it might be decomposed, but within the state as a whole. So Altieri concludes with reference to the final scene of the play. All of this, what I just summarized, then makes possible a final affective intensity sustained by Othello's having to realize just how much distance there can be between the self who acts and the subsequent self who has to make an accurate assessment of how that action changed him. Othello's self-consciousness has no other life at this point but to sound that difference. Therefore, his final speeches resound with a sublime tension between awareness of being reduced to a guilty thing and the expansive sense of how passion brought him to this impasse by, for a short time, letting him experience just how much the psyche can stake on being loved. Well, the philosophical lesson to be drawn, as Altieri puts it, is that agents have interests in their own emotions that have nothing to do with, or nothing directly to do with the realization of desire or with achieving knowledge of a sort which could be detached and exported from the passion, the affective state itself. So the knowledge that they achieve in the passion can be had, one can hold on to it, only by remaining within the state itself. And this is how he, again, a statement of his general thesis. An aesthetic orientation will focus on how we actually have interests in qualities basic to the emotions and how we find satisfaction within the very modes of participation that consciousness allows and extends. So, that Altieri. Well, if these suggestions are in any way persuasive, then the ground has been laid for Nietzsche, to whom I turn next. Now, the idea that emotion or affect or feeling are of high importance to Nietzsche really hardly needs to be said. It will be agreed also, I think, that they play no single role in his thought, but rather several different roles. The one that matters from present purposes is the conception which is to the fore in The Birth of Tragedy, but like much in that work, lasts into his later writings in one form or another. The idea that the good must be conceived as involving, if not as consisting in, a particular kind of affective state. Exactly how close the connection is just won't matter for my purposes. I just want to focus on Nietzsche's idea that states of passion can instantiate value. The famous formula in Birth of Tragedy that the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon is naturally read as referring to the experience of worldly objects as having aesthetic qualities. And on the face of it, this must indeed be what Nietzsche is saying. It's what he thinks the Homeric Greeks were so good at, giving the world, above all themselves, an Apollonian appearance. And this task of shaping phenomena as they appear artistically through selective vision, perspectival modification, all of the tricks, returns later as a central theme in Nietzsche's gay science. But the other half of the equation which goes to form tragedy, the Dionysian, has to do not with the way that aesthetic appearances of objects condition our affects, but rather with an internally generated state, which Nietzsche calls Rausch, variously translated as, I think, rapture, ecstasy, intoxication, and which in its pure form abolishes world awareness, object awareness altogether, and indeed also the self or self-consciousness. Nietzsche's metaphysics of the Dionysian, which purport to tell us what makes it possible for us to experience Rausch, are another matter and can be left aside here. What matters is that Nietzsche thinks that in the experience of tragic art and in the form of life which it sustains and promotes, the spectatorial and the Dionysian standpoints combine, allowing self-apprehension and the internal expression of psychological force to form an essential unity. And Nietzsche's term for this condition, borrowed from Schiller, is the aesthetic state. And there are some striking passages in the late Nachlass which talk of an overflowing of energy into vision, an apprehension, a way of apprehending the world which in turn re-stimulates the subjective forces that give rise to it. It is accordingly tempting to propose a rewriting of Nietzsche's thesis in The Birth of Tragedy so that it reads, "The world is justified only for and to a subject who enjoys the aesthetic state, or more strongly, and bringing Nietzsche even closer to Schiller, only a subject who is in the aesthetic state can justify, hence affirm, their own existence. Well, this assimilation of the good to the aesthetic state, again, whether that's whole or partial, is nothing if not radical and original. In some of the sketches for Birth of Tragedy, and at one point in the text itself, Nietzsche half hints that it might be considered a form of happiness, but its value is certainly not hedonic. It's not even clear that the aesthetic state, is in any straightforward sense pleasurable or purely pleasurable. And in contrast with Schiller, Nietzsche does not think that the aesthetic state is mandated by or derives its significance from the needs of our power of reason or the requirements of morality or the necessity of uniting freedom and nature or anything of that sort. Nietzsche's idea, as I understand it, is that the aesthetic state, in addition to sustaining itself in a causal or psychological sense, is also axiologically self-sufficient. If we have it, then we need nothing more. And what gives this a special advantage in cultural circumstances where reflection has become corrosive is that it presupposes no theoretical commitments on the part of the subject. Well, given the peculiarity of this highly unorthodox conception of the good, or part conception of the good, we might reasonably ask how Nietzsche arrived at it and what its rationale might be. And here it is helpful to go back to Schopenhauer. Alongside the main line of argument in World as Woman Representation are numerous remarkable passages which try and flag the way in which his metaphysical picture resonates with life as lived. And two of these, I think, can be regarded as supplying Nietzsche with building blocks for his conception of the aesthetic state as a key component of the good. The first is Schopenhauer's conception of our double existence. Schopenhauer tells us that alongside our perceptually given surroundings, we lead, as he puts it, a second life in concepts, thanks to our power of reason. We can abstract from what is immediately given and take, as his words, a panoramic view of life as a whole and contemplate it with equanimity. I'll read the passage. It is noteworthy, indeed marvelous, that we human beings always lead a second abstract life alongside our concrete life. In the first, we are subject to all the storms of reality and are prey to the influence of the present. We must strive, suffer, and die as animals do. But our abstract life, as it appears before us in rational contemplation, is the calm reflection of the first life and the world it is lived in. In this realm of peaceful deliberation, what had previously possessed us completely and moved us deeply now appears cold, colourless, and strange to the eye. Here we are simply onlookers and spectators. In this retreat into reflection, we are like actors who have played our scene and now take our seats among the audience before we have to return to the stage. Anything may now happen on the stage, even the preparation of our own death. And looking out from the audience, we view it with equanimity. But then we return to act and suffer as we must. So the second life, which is overlaid on our concrete animal existence, is decisive, according to Schopenhauer, for what we are able practically to affirm. It's what allows us to, for example, sacrifice our lives for a principle or ideological cause. The other element is Schopenhauer's idea of an unaccountable weight or gravity suffusing the world. That is unaccountable in terms of the world as representation, which consequently warms us up at the transition to the world as will. So this passage is from the beginning of Book 2, where he's making that transition. We will be particularly interested in discovering the true meaning of intuitive representation. We have only ever felt this meaning before, but this is ensured. But This has ensured that the images do not pass by as strange and meaningless as they would otherwise necessarily have done. Rather, they speak and are immediately understood and have an interest that engages our entire being. What goads us to further philosophical research is simply the fact that we're not satisfied with knowing that we have representations. We want to know the meaning of those representations. We ask if this world is nothing more than representation, in which case it would have to, if it were nothing but representation, it would have to pass over us like an insubstantial dream or a ghostly phantasm not worth our notice, or in fact, whether it is something else, something more, and if so, what this could be. This much is certain: what we're looking for would have to be wholly and completely different from representation. Now, these two elements jointly set the scene, in a way, for Schopenhauer's pessimism. So, without the weight supplied by will, the extra item that we're going to move on to, the spectacle that passes before us would be rational, it will be self-explaining, it will be in conformity with the principle of sufficient reason as Schopenhauer understands it, but it would be meaningless, or no more meaningful than a dream. But with the will and the weight added, it becomes unendurable on account of the horrors that it presents us with and the preponderance of pain over pleasure within it. So, caught between, as it were, the unbearable lightness of being and its equally unbearable gravity, the only option is to turn our backs, life denial. Well, Nietzsche, as I'm reconstructing him, takes over Schopenhauer's notions first that our vision is, in a sense, bifocal. We can overlay a second life of our own contrivance on what life concretely presents us with. And second, Schopenhauer's idea that will, in some form, is what really gives things their ponderous reality. But Nietzsche thinks it possible for these two things, these two factors, to join together in a way that Schopenhauer didn't envisage, and which provides for a non-pessimistic solution to the genuine existential problem that Nietzsche thinks Schopenhauer correctly identified. So in the aesthetic state, Nietzsche supposes we are able to, as it were, harness will and convert the effects of gravity, which would otherwise drag us down into life denial, into a power of our own, a life-affirmative power of flight, if you like. And what makes this possible is precisely our appreciation of the irreality of what Schopenhauer is calling the world as representation. So the resulting state can be compared in a simile that Nietzsche uses again and again to a waking dream in which we desire to dream on. Because we are awake, we can engage our wills in full self-consciousness, so the dream can have substance, and as Schopenhauer put it, hold an interest that engages our entire being, while our knowledge that whatever might ensue has in itself no greater reality than a dream immunizes us against catastrophe, and in a strange way makes suffering, the preponderance of pain over pleasure, not matter. So the two conditions that Schopenhauer thinks we merely alternate between in schizoid fashion, either on the stage, animal immersion in concrete practical life, or in the audience, disengaged contemplation. For Nietzsche, these are fused into a single state in which we are at once actors and audience. So what Schopenhauer describes as a ghostly phantasm not worth our notice is, or can be, Nietzsche thinks, elevated to a kind of positive fiction of which we take ownership and in which we stand to suffer no loss. And what shows the possibility of this very, very strange configuration, according to Nietzsche, is tragedy, or music drama. Well, the genius of this strategy of Nietzsche's consists then in accepting Schopenhauer's stripped down, excruciatingly stripped down view of our fundamental situation and reversing his pessimistic conclusion, without introducing anything that Schopenhauer might reject as begging the question. There is more to be said in support of the idea that Nietzsche regards passion as a passion, at least of the right kind, which springs from a source within the subject and manifests itself in a mode of vision as a good in itself. I'm going to cut this down a little bit in order not to run out of time. Hamlet is described in section 7 of The Birth of Tragedy as exhibiting one facet of Dionysian man. He is the Dionysus worshipper who finds himself post-intoxication in the cold grey dawn, nauseated by existence and paralyzed by knowledge. And this last characteristic of, as Coleridge calls it, ratiocinative meditativeness, the Hamlet who is sicklied over the pale cast of thought, is highly familiar. And it raises the question of why Nietzsche should draw any association of Hamlet with the Dionysian. If Hamlet is a reflective modern who tends to nihilism, then it seems he counts as a descendant of Socrates, not of Aeschylus and Sophocles. So the question is, what in Nietzsche terms makes it possible for Shakespeare to build a tragedy around such a figure, given that Nietzsche, of course, rejects Schopenhauer's interpretation of the work, the play, as a lesson in the necessity of resignation? Well, Nietzsche does not spell it out, but there is a way in which Hamlet fits Nietzsche's characterization of the Dionysian, for which some sporting evidence can be found in other references in his texts and in a passage on Macbeth, which I'm going to come to in a moment. Also embedded in Hamlet's psychology, as a kind of counterweight to his disposition to irony, is his unfeigned passion for passion. He is exhilarated at being harrowed by the ghost of his father. He is delighted at the arrival of the players. He puts to them an importunate demand, an immediate demand for a passionate speech. He exhibits a zeal in manufacturing, staging situations which raise the emotional temperature. Well, this will to passion, which lies at the other extreme from Hamlet's meditative excess, creates the tension in his personality required for a modern form of tragedy. So I'm suggesting what makes it Hamlet for Nietzsche, not a mere anticipation of late moderns, disenchanted late moderns, but also, or instead, a Dionysian figure, is the value that Hamlet sets on affective life for its own sake. One part of Hamlet accepts Schopenhauer's pessimistic conclusions. Another part shares with the tragic Greeks the knowledge that what is of supreme importance is that the movement of affect should take place at any cost, whether its grounds are real or fictive. If the measure of passion lay outside it, for us or for Hamlet, then really the course of the play, in terms of the revenge motive and the execution of justice, would have to be regarded as something like an abortive farce, whereas in fact it ends with self-affirmation. Hamlet, like Othello, is able to hear the good resonating in his own destruction. So he instructs Horatio to tell his tale, as does Othello to Lodovico. And this is, I think, what Yeats has in mind when he says, with the great, I quote, with the great stage curtain about to drop, Shakespeare's tragic protagonists discover gaiety transfiguring all that dread, heaven blazing into the head. And a similarly affirmative view emerges. So this is a passage in a later work of Nietzsche's from which the metaphysics of Birth of Tragedy are absent. Whoever thinks that Shakespeare's theatre has a moral effect and the sight of Macbeth irresistibly repels one from the evil of ambition is in error. He is again in error if he thinks that Shakespeare himself felt as he feels. He who is really possessed by raging ambition beholds this, its image, with joy. And if the hero perishes by his passion, this precisely is the sharpest spice in the hot draught of his joy. Do you suppose that Tristan and Isolde are preaching against adultery when they both perish by it? This would be to stand the poets on their head. They, and especially Shakespeare, are enamored of the passions as such. The tragic poet has just as little desire to take sides against life with his images of life. He cries rather, "It is the stimulant of stimulants, this exciting, changing, dangerous, gloomy, often sun-drenched existence. It is an adventure to live. Espouse what party you will, it will always retain this character." Well, this recalls what we saw Altieri say about Othello, and it seems fair to say that this reflexive, affirmative character of the final moment of recognition in Shakespearean tragedy, so this is a sort of Shakespeare's version of Aristotle's Anagnoresis, is brought out if we draw comparison with Racine, and I owe this case to Anthony, to Phèdre. In Phèdre, passion is simply ethically negative. It is just an obstacle in our pursuit of the good. The passion which drives the course of the play, Phèdre's incestuous desire for her stepson Hippolytus, is represented in beautiful Alexandrines, but the verse keeps its beauty for itself. And this allows us to recognize Phèdre as noble, insofar as she raises herself up in opposition to her passion, but Phèdre is not allowed by Racine to find aesthetic value in her own passion. So she cannot affirm her own fate. There is no occasion for self-affirmation of the sort achieved by the protagonists of Shakespearean tragedy. Well, still some way to go from what I've just been talking about to the idea that I described at the beginning of my paper. So Hamlet and Macbeth are clearly not run-of-the-mill subjects of emotion, and life as viewed through the lens of tragic art is a special case. So the question is, even if a potential for aesthetic self-experience in passion is realized in tragedy, why should we conclude anything more general concerning the passions from this? And this takes us to the blindingly obvious objection, which may have been in your minds from pretty much the beginning. Granted that there can be an interest in affect of the sort I've described, which Altieri's talked about, which differs from ethical and cognitive interest, why call it aesthetic? And the concept of the aesthetic has, after all, so many connotations which seem missing from the case at hand. Even if we waive all of those strong Kantian requirements of disinterestedness and so on, aesthetic interest is directed towards an object of appreciation which we can explore from different angles. Passions, as given in first-order experience, are obviously not like that. We do talk of episodes of feeling as, we can say, it stopped us in our tracks, or one can, I suppose, say an episode of feeling eluded my attention. But the objectuality of those sorts of mental inner items, and here there's a contrast with pains, itches, and other somatic objects, is really vanishing. So not even the most adept student of Proust or Valéry could perform within the stream of consciousness the kind of mental acrobatics which would be needed to fix la vie intérieure in the manner of a pigmented canvas or the words on a page. So the problem is that although, of course, passion can exhibit sensational qualities by virtue of its felt immediacy as do pleasure and pain, and it can recruit to itself certain characteristic patterns of thought, it lacks the robust objectuality needed for it to command aesthetic interest. And I'll skip a bit here, but this would be an appropriate point for a second suspicion or objection to be voiced, which is namely that the thesis that there is an inherent aesthetic potential in passion reads into passion or emotion as a type of mental state, something which is in fact specific to the case of art. So it, as it were, builds into, inside the subject, something which can only occur in the subject-object relation as it's presented to us in aesthetic contexts. So that, very briefly, is the obvious problem. A start can be made on, this is the attempt to explain how it is that, how can we make sense of the idea that in the having of passion, passion itself can exhibit an aesthetic dimension or aesthetic qualities. The start can be made if we look at, oddly enough, Kant's account of what is needed to differentiate the aesthetic in our sense of the beautiful from the merely agreeable. So, the problem of taste, familiar from Hume, only a feeling of pleasure can ground a judgment of taste, but the content of a judgment of taste is not simply that the object has given us or is capable of giving us pleasure. On that basis, Kant argues a complex implicit structure must be contained within or in the background to the species of pleasure peculiar to beauty. And Kant puts this by saying that judgments of beauty, though grounded on feeling, are also reflective. And Kant develops this model according to which the key to the aesthetic lies not in the properties of the object. The object, in fact, becomes something more like a precipitant or occasioning cause, but in the internal configuration of the subject. So, as Kant has it, the experience of beauty involves first an internal relation between the different mental powers of the subject, and secondly, the subject's own cognition of that relation through sensation and judgment. And then these two levels within the subject reinforce one another, with the result that we linger indefinitely over the object. Well, leaving aside all of the details, the key point is that, according to Kant here, and as in any case surely seems plausible, in order for an object to be registered as aesthetically significant rather than merely agreeable or disagreeable, special subjective conditions need to be satisfied, which go beyond, something which will go beyond the reference to an object involved in a perceptual state or the representational content of a belief or desire. So the idea I now want to explore is that, perhaps appearances to the contrary, there is some reason for thinking that some such structure is found in passion or emotion. Certainly it's nothing like what Kant postulates to account for our feeling of the beautiful, but it qualifies nonetheless as an internal structure enough to make sense of the idea that emotions can give us aesthetic experiences or present us with aesthetic appearances. So the fourth, so this is part 4 of my talk. Something general to be said about attempts to construct general philosophical theories of emotion proceed quite naturally on the assumption that they are in some way compounded out of the type of content which common sense psychology makes available in ascriptions of propositional attitudes and of feelings and sensations. What, of course, makes this reasonable is, of course, the necessary connection of emotion with belief and desire, and if this is something different, with evaluative judgments or pro-attitudes, and the necessary connection of emotion with pleasure and pain. And this approach yields then, in turn, an explanation of the necessary connection of emotion with action. Actions dispose us to act in certain ways, and it allows sense to be made of the normative appraisal of emotion. We can say a bad emotion is one that betrays a vicious desire, inappropriate emotion reflects a false belief, and so on. Well, the problem with this, and here the dialectic is entirely familiar and rehearsed many times in the literature, the question is, what is it that needs to be added, something must need to be added to the complex of beliefs and desires which comprise the nucleus of an emotion in order for it to form a genuine synthetic unity. And it seems here we face a choice between identifying this missing supplementary item either with a further judgment, the content of which goes beyond the belief and desire preconditions, or with something non-judgmental and phenomenal, or a bodily state. Well, the former yields the puzzle of what is then the content of this supplementary judgment. And here the threat is that we go full circle. And in any case, what we have here is still, on the face of it, insufficient to account for the phenomenal aspect of emotion, the fact that emotion is felt in a way beliefs and desires aren't. The latter option leaves mysterious the transition from beliefs and desires to the phenomenal item, as well as the nature of the latter, insofar as it seems plainly unsatisfactory to prize apart the thought content of an emotion from the feeling that manifests it. So the feeling of jealousy and the thoughts that jealousy involved cannot be treated as independent things. Well, if this is a fair summary of the difficulty facing theories of emotion, and as I say, it seems to be acknowledged as such. So the problem is, how do we make emotions philosophically intelligible without reducing them to mere aggregates? Then I think the following train of thought becomes attractive. If the problem, or rather the first of them, in fact two have emerged, is that emotion, while having an intimate connection with the content available in belief and desire, does not seem constructible out of it, then we have to look elsewhere for the content. And if the second problem is that emotion combines content and phenomenal elements or felt elements in an essential unity, then we must look for a kind of content which will make that combination intelligible. That is, a kind of content which by its nature calls for phenomenal expression, a manifestation in feeling. Well, this is a very tall order, which I'm not able to fill, but what I'm going to suggest is limited and really just geared to showing that there is a way of trying to respond to these demands which would help to make sense of the idea that passions are capable of exhibiting an aesthetic dimension. In a classic paper from 1969, Richard Wollheim argued that the mind should be understood as operating under two images of itself. It conceives itself on the one hand as an extensionless point moving along the single axis of time, as when I engage in discursive reflection. But it also conceives of itself as a place, that is, as having a certain extent, allowing it to act as a container marked by boundaries, such that it can represent itself as either including or excluding, and as either incorporating or expelling particular objects. The mind's conception of itself as a place, Wollheim supposes, develops originally out of infantile experience of the body and remains to some degree throughout our lives modelled on it. It is, in a phrase that Wollheim borrows from Freud, a bodily ego. Well, the full theoretical interest of this conception for Wollheim is that it makes room for those forms of psychoanalytic theory which postulate an inner world populated by figures formed through fantasy and modified in accordance with psychological need in ways that contrast with the conscious, rational organization of mental life. This conception is exemplified in the notions which have found their way into folk psychology of projection and identification. The idea I get rid of a bit of myself that I don't want by placing it outside me in somebody else, or I relate to some object or some body outside me as if to something internal to my own mind. So, this is the conclusion of Wollheim's essay. It is in large part due to the insights to the experience of psychoanalysis that today we have a view at once larger and more complex of this matter. I have talked of our conception of the mind as tinged with spatiality. I've set this beside other conceptions of the mind, heavier with history and also heavier with spatiality. All such conceptions derive ultimately from an assimilation of the mind to the body of mental activity, to bodily functioning of mental contents, to the parts of the body. So the mysterious union of mind and body occurs also at a stage further back than the traditional philosophers apprehended. It is not merely that we are at home in our body, we are at home in our mind somewhat as in a body. Well, acceptance of this, of the strong Kleinian form of psychoanalytic theory that Wollheim defends, though in my view credible and substantiated, is not strictly required for present purposes. What matters is just the rather vaguer idea that there is a level of non-conscious mental content which operates under the conception of the mind as a place, or at least is experienced in such terms, or to weaken it still further, that there is a kind of content which we can get hold of, avow, and describe only by using spatial and bodily metaphors. And my suggestion is that it is this sort of content which has to be assumed if we are to fully make sense of the difference between emotion and other kinds of mental state. The claim is not, of course, that this content comprises the whole of the emotion. If it did, then it would remove them from the network of propositional attitudes, but rather just that it lies at the root. It supplies the basic stuff which comes to be worked up, informed by belief and desire, and recognized self-consciously and evaluated normatively. So to try and put the basic idea in rough psychoanalysis-free terms, the thought is that in the case of any well-formed passion of the sort that can act as a motive, such as Othello's jealousy, there just has to be something that is going on inside the mind, something that the mind is doing. And it's this going on or doing that is registered in conscious episodes of feeling. These episodes of feeling constitute the meeting point of the mind's two self-images, the extensionless point of self-consciousness on the one hand, and the mind's image of itself as extended on the other. Hence the involvement of the notion of concepts of movement in the characterization of an emotion. To have an emotion in the face of this or that is to be moved by it. But the real external object does not, of course, literally move the mind. Rather, it elicits a movement within the mind. Hence also the curious fusion of passivity and activity characteristic of affective states, which on occasion we describe as assailing us like physical forces, like pains, but which we can never regard as doing so without our participation. When we recognize an emotion as what it is, we acknowledge it to be ours and to have put ourselves into it in some way. Well, some recent writing on emotion attempting to rehabilitate emotion for rational life has argued that it should be regarded as a kind of adjunct to practical and theoretical reasoning, and there is no need to deny that emotion is able to function in those ways in order to doubt, I think, that this provides a full characterization of the total work that emotion does in the mind. No less central than its contribution to inference drawing and the desire formation and so on is the resistance that emotion is capable of putting up to reasoning. And the essential point here, which is reflected in the perennial attractiveness of the notion that emotion has a logic of its own, is that emotion has the power not simply to not just to block the deliverances of practical and theoretical reason, like a natural force in the way that sheer physical exhaustion can cancel my resolution, but to seemingly invalidate them. emotion, passion, has the capacity to make reason, judgment appear to have missed the point. So passion can be experienced as cancelling or overtaking the authority of principled reflection. That emotion, like desire, is able to at least seem to operate under the guise of the good, is reflected in the way in which it characteristically sponsors imaginative scenarios which are internally intelligible to the subject. So the power of this alternative affective intelligibility to undercut reason or hold it in check is, I'm suggesting, possible only if emotion brings with it its own way of thinking, that is, if we suppose it to have its own source of content independent of that which goes into propositional attitudes. Well, this way of thinking about, close to finishing, this way of thinking about emotion is not without historical precedent, and I pointed to Nietzsche, but I said Nietzsche doesn't really offer very much by way of conceptual analysis of passion. But there are other figures in whom we find elements of the view I've sketched. And here is a quotation from Spinoza. And this is concerned with the emotions in general terms. Pleasure, pain, and consequently the emotions that are compounded of these or derive from them are passive emotions. Now, we are necessarily passive insofar as we have inadequate ideas, and only insofar as we have inadequate ideas are we passive. That is to say, we are necessarily passive only to the extent that we imagine or form mental images, to the extent that we are affected in a way that involves both the nature of our own body and the nature of an external body. And second quotation, this is illustrating this conception from Spinoza's discussion of jealousy. This hatred towards the object of one's love, joined with envy, is called jealousy, which is therefore nothing else but vacillation arising from simultaneous love and hatred accompanied by the idea of a rival who is envied. He who thinks of a woman whom he loves as giving herself to another will not only feel pain by virtue of his own appetite being checked, but also being compelled to associate the image of his love with the sexual parts of his rival. He will feel disgust for her. Well, Spinoza's theory of inadequate ideas and formation of mental images, which echo in a non-causal way, but leave all that aside, bodily states, along with his conception of the peculiar and distinctive laws that govern the combination of these ideas. All of this seems to me extraordinarily close to the view of passion suggested by Wollheim's psychoanalytically inspired discussion. Well, Spinoza, as these quotations show, famously thinks that human nature yields to a kind of geometrical decompositional analysis. And just to correct for this, though without, I think, contradicting Spinoza's theory, here is a passage from Bergson from Time and Free Will, just reminding us that passions present themselves in feeling not as aggregates, but as semi-substantial unities. So he writes, this overwhelming of the immediate consciousness is nowhere so striking as in the case of our feelings. It may be that the better translation would have been emotions or passions. A violent love or a deep melancholy takes possession of our soul. Here we feel 1,000 different elements which dissolve into and permeate one another without any precise outlines, without the least tendency to externalize themselves in relation to one another, hence their originality. We distort them as soon as we distinguish a numerical multiplicity in their confused mass. And this is the bit that matters. The feeling itself, or the emotion itself, is a being which lives and develops and is therefore constantly changing. Otherwise, how could it gradually lead us to form a resolution? Our resolution would be immediately taken. So the passage puts into sharp relief, I think, the way in which we experience and conceive passion in some of its forms as a semi-substantial organic whole, something which transcends and grounds our dispositions to episodes of feeling. And Bergson's thought is that this realist conception of emotion is instanced whenever an episode of feeling is taken as revealing the mind to itself. So if this is right, or roughly plausible, then we can begin to understand why it is, how it can be that passions have a volume and substantiality which is not exhibited by other kinds of mental state. Affective phenomenology has a depth, an interior thickness that perceptual experience and merely discursive episodes in mental life do not have. And this is what allows passion to exhibit an aesthetic dimension. We apprehend in passion, we are capable of apprehending in passion in some of its forms, a composite scene which, whether or not it takes control of our belief and resolution, as in Othello's case, is capable of holding an interest that, to use Schopenhauer's phrase once again, an interest that engages our entire being. Thank you.